I'm pleased to welcome all the invited speakers, I would say. You know, some had to leave due to, the situation, going to the flight, traffic jam and so on, and also because there is a special day tomorrow with celebration of the death of the King Bhumibol last year. So it's a long weekend, and so people are expecting a traffic jam, but I'm still confident on the traffic in Bangkok. When I would say it was decided to look at the gut health, and you remember Philippe started the first slide with a slide on this gut content, and this mention of Hippocrates, which is quite a long time ago, to say life sits in the bowel and by digestion is the root of the evil, and he say health and disease sit also from the gut. So it's really an important topic, and I'm sure even if a lot of people had to leave, but you are still concerned by this issue, and you can be persuaded that this week was a week on gut health. I just realized that this week, not only the IHSIG conference was organized here with 470 participants. There was also the Beneficial Microbes Conference organized in Amsterdam exactly on the same date. Also another meeting on the Animal Health, Feed and Nutrition Summit in Madrid, in Spain, and also a live webinar on All About Feed today on the same topic. So it's really quite interesting to see how many people came here to Bangkok when you have so many different conferences on the same topic. So it's a real important topic. And unfortunately, some people are not here for the roundtable, but we can excuse them. You remember, for those who were at IHSIG last year in São Paulo, I quoted the NE, because at that time we had a lot of topics on NE. NE means for everybody. What is the first meaning you think about when you talk about NE?
Necrotic.
Great, you can tell. So necrotic enteritis. But in fact, this year, I think I should add another E with Emeria, because we had a lot of talks on Emeria, so I think now it's NEE. But in that case, translating that to what I said last year is maybe more difficult. So last year I say NE is also nutrition ecology. And we heard a lot on the feedstuff, the additives that can modify the feedstuff, transform some end product to prebiotics or some products that can be used by the microbiota and so on. So I said last year, we are really feeding an ecosystem. And if I add another E, I should say feeding an ecosystem efficiently. And just to summarize what we understand by gut health, I think I can take the triptych that everybody knows. You see the diet, and when you talk about the diet, you talk about the nutrients, you talk about the macro and micronutrients. We talk a lot about additives, and you have seen that people are passionate by their product. The anti-nutritional factors and the imbalance and excess. And we had an excellent presentation to look at alternatives for feedstuff. That is important. We talk, and it's important in the interaction with microbiota. When we talk about microbiota, in fact, and host mucosa, which is the animal, we talk about an equilibrium when we talk about gut health. And I would like, and I plan to have 2-hour roundtable, so at the beginning, so to say we have time to dig on each part and maybe to review what has been presented and maybe challenge with a different short presentation too. But we receive a lot of questions. And first I would say that the invited speakers, you will be able to re-watch their presentation on the IHSIG platform and on the FeedChannel platform. That will give you more time to understand what has been shown, because I'm sure that a lot of people have seen that a bit too quickly and they would like to re-listen to the presentations. And for the question we received, you will see also the answers to the question on the website, because too many questions and some of the speakers have left to answer to that questions today. And on the microbiota, we talk about cross-feeding and quorum sensing, which means sometimes a bit special words. Bacteria are producing metabolites and they can feed each other. So for the nutritionist, it's important also to understand how we can modify the metabolite produced by the bacteria to influence the other bacteria. And quorum sensing, we had a question on that regarding the presentation of yesterday to explain a bit better, in fact, what do you mean by quorum sensing? So I think maybe we could start by this microbiota part, and I would ask who wants to comment a bit more on today. We look at the microbiota profile, and I think we had an excellent presentation from Manusak from CP about evaluation of the profile. We had a presentation from Philippe and Rick on more the functional interaction between the microbiota. Would you like to comment on that? Maybe you can
comment something about my study or about my...
Yeah, today you are more looking at the microbiota profile.
Yes.
And I think the complementary aspect is maybe so.
So actually I should not be the first one who mentioned about
yeah, maybe in that case,
yes,
Philippe, if you want to. It's yeah.
Well, I didn't really get the exact question, but I think you mean that we are now looking at, well, if we look at, for example, effects of different nutritional strategies or feed additives, we always look now at, well, we compare microbial composition. Huh? I mean, we try to target or seek for species or genera or families that really are suddenly, well, coming up in abundance, and as Rob showed, there's quite a lot of variability. Huh? And I think the redundancy is quite important, no? Many different bacterial genera and families just have exactly the same function, but of course, well, are different. If you do 16S sequencing, you can have such a variety, well, you can have completely different microbial profiles. You think they are completely different, but the function is exactly the same. So I think that's some complexity we need to take into consideration. So at the end, I think we need to go to whatever kind of functional, well, functional assay not, but just you know, trying to identify somehow how we can, well, use some kind of tool that really determines the function of the microbiota, not only just using, well, taxonomy.
Yeah, maybe Martin?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of a statement also. I think the time that we have to study all these difficult names that we haven't heard before is a little bit behind us, because I think in the future we will talk about mode of actions of probiotic strains, and I think it's also going to be more relevant than just looking at a certain species. Like this was the one question about these two Bacillus subtilis strains, two different companies with two different mode of actions apparently. So that's an interesting thing. So even when you have the same bacterium, they can, or same species, you can have different functions, and that's very intriguing to me. Yeah,
one of the questions was, in fact, when you look at the microbiota profile and you talk about genus, genus doesn't mean anything, I would say, when you look at the precise metabolism and functionality. Maybe you have a comment on that.
So mostly I start with the 16S metagenomic first. I use this kind of thing for screening, I would say, because I can use this thing kind of robustness. I can submit like 200 or 300 samples per run. It's easy for us to screening. But when we're talking about functional, I cannot submit all 200 samples. I have to select maybe 5 or 10 samples only to start about the functional. So I concern. I know the bacteria that live inside cecum or ileum, maybe they just stay there. They're not working.
Yeah.
Or I don't know if they work or not, but maybe they just stay there. So the important thing, we have to study functional and also going to the metabolite. But the thing is, right now we try to utilize using the 16S metagenomics screening and see something first, and then we pick up the right one to study. This is the thing that I try to set up in my research center.
Maybe Robert.
Yeah, so I think it's important that we have to get to function, obviously, and the most direct way to do that at the moment is really to look at the metabolome. You know, looking at anything from just a few, you know, short-chain fatty acids to the hundreds and hundreds that a lot of the technology can do now. But there's still a challenge there because we can't then directly connect the metabolites back to the organisms that are producing those things. I mean, in some cases we can make predictions, but in trying to manipulate that afterwards, you really need to know the organisms that are producing that metabolome.
Yeah.
And so even though the metabolome tells you functionally what's going on, it's still difficult to do anything with that knowledge.
Yeah, but maybe an interesting point we've seen in the presentation is you can classify, I would say, a good performance and maybe a bad performance with some profile, but they are not the same between the 10 chickens used. So in fact, it means that, in fact, maybe the microbiota profile per se is not a good signature of the functionality, no? I know that you argue, Philippe and Robert, yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, it is a signature, but the trouble is that there's not just one signature.
Yeah.
There's a dozen, 100, you know, I mean, there's different ways, as I said, to get to the same end. That's the challenge. I think it's easier to define what's bad rather than what's necessarily good.
I think the problem is also you will be able to define microbial signatures for really pathological conditions, for diseases. What we are looking at here is something very, very complex because it's just performing good and bad, and that can have so many different reasons that I think it's impossible to have really a signature for that. I mean, that's probably the difficult thing, you know? Because even in your studies, you saw good and poor performing animals, and within the same group, within the same stable, that had a completely different. Yes. So I think that's tricky. I mean, this is coming from the human side, of course, but there they use really specific pathological conditions, and then you can easily, define a signature. But for this, it's not. It's a syndrome or whatever, or it's something else. It's not a disease.
I mean, just to add to that, to make it even more complex, of course, you can have the same bacteria, but in a different host or a different queue, you can see different transcription profiles. Yeah. And so, you know, what could appear to be the same bacteria could be up or down regulating an efflux pump or a toxin or anything like this. So a combination of perhaps metabolomics, next-gen transcriptomics, it just makes for needing a very, very big computer.
Yeah, it's interesting, in fact, in the presentation also, the interaction, I think I put pathogens. We always talk about bacteria to bacteria, but we had a presentation on virus, presentation on parasites, and there is definitely an interaction between the parasite and the microbiota. And when we make the microbiota profile and so on, maybe sometime we should also evaluate the complete gut health, including the parasite, because everybody said Emeria is always there, Clostridium is always there, but at a level which is not maybe problematic, but it might influence the microbiota. What are your comment on that?
Sorry,
the influence of the parasite, of the pathogen, I would say, parasites, virus, and so on the microbiota profile and on the microbiota metabolism.
So it's very interesting with parasites, especially with Eimeria, because of course there's such a strong immune response. Yeah. So the time at which they're exposed to the parasite will determine when it happens, when you have a sudden proliferation of the parasite, you have the damage in the gut. And then to a large extent, it might be gone after a week. Whereas we're talking about bacterial colonization and Clostridium and so on, of course, they may then colonize and stay consistently for a while before they obviously fluctuate. And all of this is going on when you can look at different host genotypes, different parasite genotypes. Again, some are more or less pathogenic. So it makes for a very complex mix.
Yeah, good. We also had a lot of presentation on different products or solutions or interconnection between the feedstuff, the degradation of the feedstuff. So I put a statement here, not a single solution. A lot of people said, in fact, you will not, I would say, replace the antibiotic and so on with only one solution. It will be one complex, maybe, solution with different possibility because you have different mode of action. And could you comment on that? Maybe Greg, who had tested so many products.
I'm not real sure. If I completely follow all the conversation. It's not in good Southern English, so, but if the conversation here is, would we use multiple approaches for control of anything, particularly performance in the United States or anywhere else, is you do have to use a multiple approach. And I certainly believe that the digestion from the diets is probably the first approach for the nutritionist in a poultry company to then work with the veterinarians for these other products, because that's really is the problem that we have right now, is the nutritionists and the veterinarians need to work together to understand all this, because I'm not sure that they attend to the same meetings. So again, I would think, yes, multiple approach is very important.
Yeah. And we were talking about the microbiota area, and I was thinking about parasite, but virus también, also. And I think today we talk also about the positive effect of virus sometimes. We talk about virome and what could be the beneficial effect on that. It's not always negative. We always think about disease and so on. But our birds, in the gut, we always talk about bacteria, but there are viruses, there are different microorganisms that can influence, like parasites. Any comment on the impact, I would say, of virus on the microbiota profile, microbiota functioning, metabolism?
I think we know that there are viruses that reside in the intestinal tract that cause no apparent health issues. Yeah. Reoviruses are a perfect example. We also detect astroviruses in hosts that are apparently healthy. Yeah. And then there are occasions where we have a breakdown in the GI tract, and some of those viruses, probably not the same strains of viruses, cause disease. So I don't know of any beneficial impacts of having some of those non-pathogenic viruses in the GI tract, but certainly it's something to keep in mind as we start to study and break down the virome.
Should we take into account the virome, in fact, when we make the microbial profile and so on? That's maybe, yeah, Damon.
I was going to just add actually a point to what you said first, in that we're talking about viruses that might be acting in the gut on the host, but actually pathogens, the parasites have their own viruses as well. Yeah. So Eimeria have several different types of viruses. If you look to the similar viruses in other better defined systems like Leishmania or Plasmodium, we see some of those viruses actually make them more pathogenic, some of them make them less fecund. So the occurrence of a virus in a strain could actually change dramatically the profile you get from a pathogen that you think you understand.
Good. Any comment from the audience? If someone wants to ask a question, and no problem, we are open to the question, because we receive a lot of questions, but it's better to have questions from the audience, from the present people. And, yeah, one question.
So, there were some presentations, interesting presentations on microbial profiling. So, I'm interested especially in Lachnospiraceae, because in some cases, or some species which belongs to Lachnospira are producing butyric acid, but some are also involved in mucin degradation. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, it's probably a very good, well, it's not probably, it is a very good question. Sorry?
For Rick, I would say.
For Rick? Yeah. Well, I'm not Rick, luckily, but yeah. A few years younger. Huh? Well, it's this mucin degradation. I mean, that's something. I mean, you can have a thick layer of mucus, a thin layer of mucus, and we don't really know what that means. But mucin degrading bacteria, it's degrading is maybe not a good word. Maybe just the host is providing mucins to bacteria to be able to stay there, and depending on which ones are colonizing there, you have a problem. Clostridium, for example, is a mucinogenic bacterium. It produces a lot of mucinases. And then if that bacterium is there, of course, it uses the mucinases to break down mucins, to connect to the epithelial cells, to make a lesion, whatever, to produce toxins. But for these bacteria, of course, yeah, the presence of mucins is good for the host, because the host is providing a substrate for bacteria that sit very closely in interaction with the epithelial cells, produce butyrate, which is beneficial. So it's really just a matter of mucins. Well, mucin degradation can be, in fact, a beneficial thing because some bacteria really are, well, sitting there very close to the epithelial cells, providing good signals, while others, such as Clostridia, are doing the opposite. So it's really a matter of, and I don't know what is really affecting mucin production for the rest. I mean, inflammation is also doing that, of course, and that creates an environment with maybe an excess of mucins that can be used by certain pathogenic strains, but it's a very difficult thing. Rob says yes.
Yeah. It's interesting because you make the transition with the host issue, host mucosa. A lot of people talk about the improving the barrier integrity, and it's always a funny aspect. It has to absorb, but it has to be very efficient to avoid contamination and so on. We talk about optimizing inflammatory status, so anti-inflammatory properties. And I think, Daima, you mentioned also the genetic, because we often forget the genetic issue. Can you further comment on the genetic aspect on the host reaction?
Well, of course, it's interesting from two levels, I suppose. So in the commercial broilers, obviously we have the mixed lines that come through, so you can have quite a variation in the birds you look at coming from different hatcheries, different flocks, different times. But then there's also, well, we're hearing about One Health all the time, and there's a real reservoir of untapped host genes in indigenous breeds around the world, in sort of backyards, the traditional lines. And so I think there's a lot of scope potentially for genes that could add, and I think like immune competence are one of the key factors.
Okay, good point. And I would like to maybe end up the discussion on the diagnosis, because a lot of people talk about how to really appreciate gut health. We looked at the different aspects, but how can we detect early enough that birds are in a good condition or they are moving toward maybe a tricky condition?
Well, if I can comment on that, I'm a little bit frustrated when I look at the scientists, because I'm a guy from the field and I'm still stuck with my scissors and my eyes to have a quick assessment of gut health. And that's what we have to work with, okay? And you've been presenting and impressing me with a lot of difficult words and nice scientific work, but it doesn't apply for people that work in the field yet, okay? So I hope that by next time you've got something for me, okay? That's my personal comment, and it's still hard work for us to do it bird by bird and subjectively scoring the birds.
And particularly on large flocks and so on, yeah.
So just to reply to that from the scientific side of the fence, it always comes back to cost, I think, is the bottom line, because there are assays out there. So there's PCR assays that have been for Imeria, for example, for more than 20 years. But it comes back to the cost of preparing DNA, running the reaction. I mean, there's things like LAMP now, you can do that pen side. So there's LAMP assays. But again, it comes back to the interest and the demand.
Yeah, of course, that's perfect for doing trials, let's say on long-term decisions. Okay, that works, I agree. And I was also learned that you can estimate the age of a scientist on the cost of the sequencing that they had when they started. That's another thing. But we need to also be able to react very quickly in the field, because the bird grows only 35, 40 days. Every 6 hours that we lose, it's dramatic. Yeah. So we have to have tools where we can estimate what to do. Should we implement an antibiotic treatment or a probiotic or organic acid or whatever? And we need to know that quickly. And that is something that
we are looking for. And they have to be cheap.
And cheap, of course, yes. Yeah.
And never forget that we are dealing with large flock of birds. So even on a practical term, it's quite difficult to look at.
I think again, Martin, the difficulty here is just exactly the same as what I just said. If you want to develop gut health biomarkers, it's very, very easy to do when you have a pathological condition, because you will have huge changes. They do that in humans and whatever, no problem at all. But you are asking for a biomarker for performance, no? More or less, and that's very
gradation. I think we all agree that we have, with these high-performing birds, we have a constant conflict between that inflammation and it's a physiological state that is not really normal, but we have to live with it. So it's like a constant inflammation which is there, and we have to try to balance it. So it's not a pathological condition, clinical, but we have to steer it, and we have to know the moment that the inflammation goes up, we have to do something. And that is something that we are looking for in the field to be able to judge when we have to do an additional treatment or not.
I think it's
But you have to anticipate the evolution.
Yes. Or even anticipate.
Yeah,
even
yeah, yeah.
possible.
I think it's very well possible to do that, but again, even if you have inflammation in the gut of chickens, it will be subtle, and that is also a very critical thing. The changes are not that huge, so to really find something in litter, for example, and if you have a subtle inflammation, it's not easy, taking into account that all these molecules that you want to use as markers are really degraded already to some extent in fecal material. You need something easy, easy, fast, whatever, so yeah, but next time we will present something. We promise you, okay? Fine.
Okay. So that will be the topic.
That's a promise.
That will be a big session on next IHSIG, surely. Yeah. Any more comment from the audience? Yeah.
So I had a presentation from Dr. Moore and also a couple of other presentations. Yeah. So as Philip mentioned right now, so it's very easy to define the pathological conditions and then identify what's happening. Yeah. So my question is like how to define good gut health, and if we are looking into the functions of the microbes, yeah. So is it are these microbes change their functions depending on all these conditions? So because like even if you see, so one of your slides showed that even the good performing flocks had different profiles of microbiota.
Yeah, I mean the microbes are going to be reacting to the environment as well. We saw a talk where the valeric acid was down-regulating a key virulence factor in Clostridia. So that's going to be happening to lots of genes across the whole population. And to try and look at that, we can do things like do the transcriptomics. But of course, there's still a large number of genes in there that we have no idea what the function is anyway. So we're always only playing with the things we know rather than all the things that are in there. But yes, I mean the organisms will certainly be reacting to their environment, in particular reacting to metabolites that other organisms within that consortium of bacteria are making. So yes, it's not just here are the bacteria, this is what they make. It's changing as well, even with exactly the same population. If there's different
So finally,
metabolites in there.
Yeah, so finally we could say that we have not simplified the story. We have opened more windows, and I'm sure it's good for the scientists to see they have more years to work on and so on, but for the practical end user, we would love to have some answers, and some really good answers to move on and to use in the field. So with that, I would say I will close the round table, except if someone wants to add something, Greg.
Well, the only, we've covered a lot here this week, and one thing we haven't really covered, and it seems to be a tremendous push in the United States now for these slower growing birds.
Yeah.
That, how is that going to be affected by what we're doing and changing in any of these
it's a good point, because in Europe and particularly in France, we have already the slow-growing birds and even the free-range birds, and it's another challenge when you talk about parasites, when you talk about microbiota and so on. So I'm sure that we have opened new windows for the future. So I would like to thank the audience for your participation and your presence still, and our keynote speakers. And thanks the organizer to give the opportunity to talk a little bit more on gut health.